Adrian adjusted his collar as he stepped into the dingy apartment, doing his best to ignore the heavy odor hanging in the air. The hallway walls were a patchwork of peeling wallpaper and creeping mold, the faint cry of a child echoing from one of the neighboring rooms. The entire building seemed to radiate despair, yet he was here to make things even harder for someone who had already lost too much. He had walked into places like this countless times, each one a variation on the same bleak theme. He reminded himself, as always, that he was just the facilitator, not the one making the choices. The door opened to reveal Sarah, her face pale and gaunt, eyes shadowed and weary beyond her years. Her clothes, frayed and hanging loose, seemed as fragile as her forced smile. Behind her, two small children sat huddled on a battered couch, watching him with wide, silent eyes. Adrian quickly averted his gaze, fixing it on the tablet in his hand, its screen glowing with the contract awaiting her signature. Sarah's smile faltered as her eyes flicked toward her children, and when she reached for the tablet, her trembling hand betrayed her exhaustion. Her fingers were thin, almost skeletal. They moved to a rickety table by the window. As Sarah began reading over the contract, Adrian scanned the room. On the wall, a single photo hung, a faded snapshot of Sarah and her children on a sunny day, her smile radiant and full of life. That version of her seemed like a stranger now, a ghost of a past she could never reclaim. 5 years, she whispered, more to herself than to him, her voice quivering. It was the maximum term for a single sale. The money might buy her some time, but Adrian knew it wouldn't be long before she'd have to make another desperate choice. He watched as she pressed her thumb to the tablet, sealing the agreement. A fleeting look of resignation crossed her face, an acknowledgement of the future slipping further out of her control. Adrian pulled a sleek, compact device from his bag and placed it against her wrist, feeling the tension ripple through her as the device activated. It hummed softly, a sound Adrian had come to associate with quiet despair. Sarah closed her eyes, her features tightening with concentration, then softening as her shoulders drooped and the years slipped away. When it was over, she looked hollowed out, her skin a shade paler, her gaze distant. She swayed slightly, catching herself on the table's edge. Adrian offered his hand, but she shook her head. "Just make sure the money goes through," she muttered, glancing toward her children. They stared in silence, too young to understand but old enough to sense the weight of what had happened. Adrian stepped off the elevator into the stark offices of Lifespan Transactions. The reception area was a study in cold minimalism, gray floors, white walls, and a single lifeless potted plant. The faint hum of machinery underpinned the occasional sharp click of heels. Straightening his tie, Adrian entered the open-plan workspace, where rows of identical desks sat under fluorescent lights. Most of his coworkers remained hunched over their screens, faces illuminated by the pale glow, their silence unsettling in its efficiency. At the far end, Ms. Grant's office, encased in frosted glass, loomed with an air of authority. Adrian knocked twice and entered when summoned. Inside, the space mirrored her persona, precise and unyielding. A mahogany desk and framed certificates dominated the room, her sharp gaze cutting through him as he sat. "Mr. Clarke," she said, sliding a slim folder across the desk. "You'll be taking over our operations at the Harding Center. Marcus Lee has retired, and the account requires immediate attention." Adrian opened the folder, scanning the neat rows of figures. "The Harding Center? I've heard of it, but it's a private care facility on the outskirts," she interrupted, her tone brisk. "Run by Dr. Samuel Harding and his sister. They manage residents who've been selling life years for decades. You'll be handling their transactions, their long-standing clients, high volume, minimal complications." Adrian hesitated, his unease rising. "And Marcus? Why did he leave?" "Personal reasons," Ms. Grant replied, her tone final. "Focus on the account. The Hardings are critical to our business, very profitable." Her eyes locked onto his. "This could be an opportunity for you, Mr. Clarke. Don't overthink it." Her clipped words dismissed further questions. Adrian left with the folder, her unspoken expectations pressing down on him. Back at his desk, he flipped through the records, their meticulous precision unnerving. The Harding Center's transactions were clean, too clean. Numbers that should have raised questions were obscured by bureaucratic polish. Frowning, Adrian reached for his phone. If anyone could explain Marcus Lee's departure, it was Marcus himself. He drafted a terse email, hesitating only briefly before hitting send. The unease gnawing at him was only beginning. The cafe sat quietly in a forgotten corner of the city. It wasn't Adrian's first choice for a meeting, but Marcus had insisted on someplace discreet. The faint aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with a soft piano melody drifting from hidden speakers. Adrian chose a corner table by the window, where pale sunlight struggled through the smog blanketing the city. He checked his watch. Marcus was late. When Marcus finally arrived, Adrian barely recognized him. The man who had once worn rumpled suits and the weary expression of an underpaid life broker now strode in confidently, dressed in a tailored blazer and polished leather shoes. A sleek, gold-accented watch caught the light as he waved at Adrian. His face, clean-shaven and glowing with vitality, was a sharp contrast to the haggard man Adrian remembered. Marcus didn't look like someone easing into retirement. He looked like someone who had just hit the jackpot. "Adrian," Marcus greeted warmly, though his tone carried an edge of urgency. "Sorry I'm late. Traffic." He slid into the seat opposite Adrian, sparing a quick, uneasy glance toward the door. "You look like you're doing well," Adrian said, gesturing to Marcus's attire. Suspicion laced his tone. Marcus chuckled, leaning back slightly as if to flaunt his transformation. "Not bad, huh? Perks of careful planning and making the right moves." He tapped his watch lightly, the motion hovering between pride and distraction. Adrian didn't return the smile. "You don't look like someone retiring for personal reasons." The chuckle faded, and Marcus's expression stiffened. "It's not always about appearances," he said curtly, then leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Listen, I don't have much time. What do you want to know?" Adrian crossed his arms, studying him. "The Harding Center. Miss Grant was vague on the details. Why'd you leave? What's really going on there?" Marcus hesitated, drumming his fingers against the table. His gaze flickered around the room, lingering on its dim corners before he leaned closer. "It's an unusual setup," he began cautiously. "A lot of money flows through that place. Plenty of opportunities if you're smart." "Opportunities?" Adrian echoed, his tone sharpening. "What kind of opportunities?" Marcus shifted uncomfortably, his foot tapping a nervous rhythm on the floor. "Look," he said, forcing a thin smile. "The Hardings aren't like other clients. They have their own way of doing things. But they're efficient, and if you play along, you'll do well." Adrian's stomach tightened. "Efficient how?" Marcus waved off the question, his smile strained. "Let's just say you'll understand soon enough. Keep an open mind. Go with the flow." The vague response only deepened Adrian's unease. "Marcus," he pressed, "what aren't you telling me?" For a moment, Marcus's confident facade cracked. "It's not a bad gig, Adrian, but if you start asking too many questions, you'll regret it." His voice dropped to a near whisper. "They're not the kind of people you cross." Adrian leaned back, frowning. "Is that a warning?" "Call it advice." Marcus forced another smile, but his eyes darted to the door again. "Look, I'm leaving for good in a few weeks. Can't risk sticking around." He stood abruptly, pushing his chair back. "Good luck, Adrian. Just be smart." Before Adrian could press him further, Marcus strode out, leaving behind the faint scent of expensive cologne and a deepening sense of dread. The car's engine hummed softly as Adrian guided it along the winding road toward the Harding Center. The outskirts of the city felt like another world compared to the congested streets and crumbling buildings he usually navigated. Here the air was sharp and clean, the roadside trees thick and watchful, their presence almost secretive. Soon the wrought iron gates of the Harding Center came into view, framed by high stone walls crowned with security cameras. At a small booth, a uniformed guard scrutinized his ID with practiced precision before pressing a button. The gates groaned open, revealing the estate beyond. At the end of a pristine gravel drive stood the mansion, grand and meticulously maintained. Its historical charm was only slightly diminished by sleek modern extensions, a juxtaposition that seemed almost absurd considering the residents within, people who had traded nearly everything for the chance to stay. Parking beside a gleaming black car, Adrian stepped out and straightened his tie. As he adjusted his jacket, a tall woman approached. Her crisp blouse and tailored slacks, paired with her neatly pinned back hair, gave her an air of composed authority. "Mr. Clarke?" she called, her voice warm yet professional. Welcome. I'm Evelyn Harding. It's a pleasure to finally meet you. Her handshake was firm, lingering just a moment too long, as if she were assessing him. Adrian smiled back, though her polished demeanor struck him as carefully rehearsed. "Thank you for having me," he replied. "Let me show you around," Evelyn said, gesturing toward the main entrance. The heavy double doors opened without a sound, revealing an entrance hall as pristine as the estate's exterior. Adrian's footsteps echoed faintly on the polished marble floor, where the subtle scent of lavender mingled with an underlying hint of antiseptic. "We strive to create an atmosphere of peace here," Evelyn said as she led him through the hall. "Our residents arrive in a vulnerable state, and our goal is to provide not only care but dignity." Adrian nodded, his eyes drifting over walls adorned with tasteful artwork and photographs. The images depicted smiling residents alongside staff. Beyond the windows, he saw expansive gardens dotted with benches and fountains, their tranquility undercut by discreetly placed security cameras. Passing a common area, Adrian caught sight of several residents seated in plush chairs, their movements slow, their expressions distant. Evelyn paused, folding her hands neatly. "Most of our residents suffer from neurological or genetic conditions that cause cognitive impairments. We do everything possible to ensure their comfort." Her tone was soothing, but a faint unease prickled at Adrian's nerves. There was a precision to her words, a subtle expectation of doubt that she seemed prepared to dispel. He nodded again, carefully masking his thoughts as Evelyn resumed the tour. Her poise mirrored the Harding Center itself, polished and inviting, yet hiding something beneath its flawless surface. The office was dim, illuminated only by the soft glow of a desk lamp. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls, their dark wood catching faint highlights from the light. Adrian's eyes scanned the titles: medical encyclopedias, journals on lifespan augmentation, and worn leather-bound volumes with faded gold lettering. The room smelled of old paper and polished mahogany, the atmosphere dense, as though the space itself scrutinized him. Behind the desk sat Dr. Samuel Harding, his salt and pepper hair neatly combed and posture effortlessly authoritative. He looked up from a file as Adrian entered, offering a warm but deliberate smile. "Ah, Mr. Clarke," Harding said, rising and extending a hand. His voice was deep, calm, and practiced, the tone of someone accustomed to commanding attention. "Welcome to the Harding Center. I trust Evelyn's tour gave you a sense of what we do here. Please, have a seat." Harding gestured to one of two leather chairs in front of his desk. Adrian sat, surprised by the chair's comfort, while Harding resumed his seat, steepling his fingers. "I'm sure Ms. Grant covered the basics," Harding began, leaning back slightly. "But I like to personally walk new brokers through the particulars. It's important that everyone understands the care we provide." He opened a folder and slid a few documents toward Adrian. "These are the pre-signed consent forms for all our residents. Each one has authorized us to manage their lifespan transactions in exchange for ongoing care. Every procedure is conducted under my supervision to ensure the highest ethical standards." Adrian glanced at the documents. The signatures were meticulous, the language precise, leaving no ambiguity. "And the residents are fully aware of what they're consenting to?" he asked carefully. Harding nodded, his expression calm. "Absolutely. Many have been selling years for decades. They understand the necessity of these transactions. Without this arrangement, they'd have no means to sustain themselves. We provide a safe, dignified environment, far better than what they'd endure outside these walls." His voice softened, taking on a paternal tone. "These people have lived hard lives, Mr. Clarke. Our role is to ensure their final years are peaceful, free from the chaos beyond these walls." Adrian flipped through the forms as Harding continued. "I won't claim the system is perfect," the doctor admitted, "but we operate within the law, and every decision prioritizes their well-being. These people have no one else, and we offer them more than care. We offer them peace." Harding's words carried a subtle magnetism, framing the situation with an air of nobility. Yet Adrian couldn't ignore the calculated precision in his delivery. He nodded, though a flicker of doubt lingered. Harding's smooth authority was almost hypnotic, but the operation's seamlessness felt too perfect. "Thank you for explaining," Adrian said, rising. Harding stood as well, offering his hand. "I think you'll find your time here rewarding, Mr. Clarke," he said, his gaze steady. "We all share the same goal, helping those in need. I'm confident you'll excel." The days since Adrian's arrival at the Harding Center passed quickly, a mix of strained professionalism and growing unease weighing on him as he completed his orientation. The manicured gardens and pristine halls, initially so inviting, had lost their charm as he settled into the rhythms of his new role. Dr. Harding's reassurances about the residents' conditions lingered faintly in his thoughts, but failed to dispel the discomfort gnawing at him. Now, standing in the medical wing, Adrian prepared to conduct his first series of lifespan transactions. His hands were steady, but his stomach churned. The medical wing was stark, a sterile contrast to the center's carefully crafted warmth. The room felt colder and emptier than any hospital Adrian had ever stepped into, its clinical precision bordering on oppressive. The first resident was already seated, a wiry woman in a faded blue robe. She appeared frail, her sunken eyes rimmed with red, though her file stated she was in her early 40s. Her trembling hands rested on her lap, knuckles sharp beneath thin, papery skin. She didn't look up, her gaze fixed on a distant point as if resigned to a passive role in her own life. Adrian cleared his throat. "Mrs. Daly?" She didn't respond. Glancing back, he caught Dr. Harding's steady gaze from the corner of the room. Harding's small nod conveyed everything. "It's normal. Continue." Adrian crouched beside her, holding out the tablet. "Your consent form is here," he said, keeping his tone soft but professional. Mrs. Daly blinked slowly, her hollow eyes finally meeting his. There was something fleeting in her expression, a flicker of recognition or perhaps resignation. Her trembling hand rose, pressing her thumb to the screen. The form confirmed what Adrian already knew: 5 years, the maximum allowed in a single transaction. Swallowing hard, he affixed the transfer device to her wrist. The machine's hum filled the silence. Mrs. Daly tensed as the process began, her breath catching briefly before her shoulders sagged. Her face grew gaunt, the lines deepening as the years drained from her. When it was over, she exhaled shakily, leaning heavily into the chair. Adrian removed the device as 2 nurses approached, helping her to her feet. "Fatigue is common," Harding said behind him, calm and detached. "They'll need rest, but they're accustomed to it." Adrian nodded, moving to the next resident, a man who barely acknowledged him. As the hours passed, one transaction blurred into the next. Each resident complied with unsettling ease, their blank acceptance more disturbing than resistance. After each procedure, they seemed diminished, slower, duller, more fragile. But Harding's reassurances rang in Adrian's ears. It's normal, they're cared for. By the time Adrian packed up the device for the day, unease had lodged firmly in his chest. Something about this felt anything but normal. The days blurred into routine, but Adrian couldn't shake the unease that had been building since his first transactions. It lingered in the sterile hallways, and most unsettlingly, in the faces of the residents. During breaks, he found himself drawn to the common areas, watching the residents in the lounge or wandering the gardens. At first, he told himself it was simple curiosity, an attempt to understand their conditions, but over time, it became something deeper. The unsettling incongruity between their appearances and behaviors gnawed at him, stirring questions he wasn't yet ready to confront. The lounge was bright and airy, with large windows overlooking the sprawling gardens. Afternoon sunlight spilled in, casting long golden streaks across the plush chairs and worn rugs. A few residents sat scattered across the room, their movements slow and subdued. Adrian leaned against the doorway, pretending to check his tablet as his eyes swept over the scene. On the carpet near a low coffee table, a woman sat cross-legged, carefully stacking wooden blocks into a wobbly tower. Her dark hair fell in loose waves around her face, and though she appeared to be in her early 60s, Adrian knew better. He'd read her file earlier that week. Lily was 32, a seller of decades to fund care for an early-onset neurodegenerative condition. At the time, the explanation seemed plausible, but now, watching her bite her lip in concentration and giggle softly when the tower toppled, the weight of it all pressed on him. The sound of her laugh felt jarring, out of place in the somber quiet of the room. "That's Lily," Evelyn said, her voice startling him. She had appeared beside him, her tone light and rehearsed. "She likes simple tasks. It helps her focus." Adrian nodded silently, keeping his gaze on Lily as she carefully picked up each fallen block, handling them as though they were delicate treasures. At the far end of the room, a man slumped in a high-backed armchair, his gaunt frame wrapped in a blanket despite the warmth. He looked to be in his 50s, gray threading his dark hair. A nurse sat beside him, murmuring as she adjusted the pillow behind his head. The man mumbled a reply, but his words fell apart into incoherence before they could form. Adrian stepped further into the room, his shoes noiseless on the thick carpet. As he passed Lily, she glanced up, her gaze wide and unguarded. For a fleeting moment, he thought he saw a question in her eyes, a silent plea for answers to questions she might not even know how to ask. But the moment passed, and she turned back to her blocks. He continued toward the garden, where more residents shuffled along gravel paths, their shadows stretching in the late afternoon sun. A few sat on benches, staring blankly at the fountains. The sharp chime of his tablet snapped him back to the present. Another transaction awaited. As he turned from the garden and headed toward the medical wing, unease coiled tighter around him, clinging like a shadow he couldn't escape. Adrian's footsteps echoed through the pristine hallway of the Harding Center as he left the medical wing. The day's transactions were complete, the monotonous hum of the transfer device replaced by the sterile quiet of the corridors. He returned to his small office on the second floor, tucked discreetly at the edge of the administrative wing. The office was modest but functional. An outdated desk, a monitor bolted to the wall, and a narrow window offering a sliver of the garden below. Dropping into the rigid chair, he rubbed his temples and opened the files on his tablet, intending to finish up before heading home. But as the screen lit up, the rows of numbers seemed to glare back at him, stirring a gnawing unease in his chest. The residents' financial records were supposed to be straightforward. Proceeds from the sale of their life years were legally required to be deposited into their accounts, and charges for care and living expenses could then be deducted on a weekly basis. Yet, as Adrian reviewed the reports, something didn't add up. The funds transferred to residents were covering far less care than their life years were worth. Mrs. Daly's 5-year sale, for instance, should have covered at least 3 years of care. Instead, the record showed a deposit that wouldn't even cover a few months, and she wasn't alone. Adrian leaned closer, his brow furrowing as he cross-referenced transaction logs with expense reports. The costs for residents' upkeep were absurdly inflated. Routine medical supplies were billed at outrageous rates, while vague entries for therapy programs and facility upgrades devoured even larger chunks of the funds. But it was the final line item that made him pause. A series of regular transfers to untraceable accounts labeled only with alphanumeric codes. The amounts in those transfers were staggering. Adrian's stomach tightened as he scrolled through months of records. The funds skimmed from each resident's sale dwarfed the actual costs of their care. The gap between what the center earned and what it claimed to spend was a vast ocean of profit, money that could only be lining someone else's pockets. The blinking cursor on the screen seemed to pulse like a distant alarm. He pulled up the company's internal guidelines on lifespan transactions. Technically, everything fell within the legal framework, provided consent forms were signed and documentation was in place. But the scale of the discrepancies was too deliberate to be dismissed as errors. This wasn't carelessness. It was calculated. Adrian exhaled slowly, a cold anger twisting beneath his ribcage. The system was flawed, but this was something worse, something deeply wrong. Pushing back from the desk, Adrian pinched the bridge of his nose and stared out the narrow window. For the first time, he allowed the thought to crystallize. Someone was siphoning the future from people who had almost none left, and he was standing in the middle of it. Adrian needed answers. Answers he was certain Ms. Grant wouldn't be eager to provide. Still, if anyone could shed light on the legal labyrinth he was beginning to uncover, it would be her. Straightening his posture, he exhaled sharply and tapped her name on his tablet's interface. The line buzzed briefly before connecting, and Ms. Grant's crisp voice filled the room. "Mr. Clarke, I assume this is important." "Yes," Adrian replied, keeping his tone steady. "I've been reviewing the accounts for the Harding Center. Some of the figures don't add up. Specifically, the residents' funds after the transactions. Let me stop you right there." She sounded more irritated than surprised, as though she'd anticipated this call. The Harding Center is a long-standing client. Their operations are fully compliant with both company policy and the law. Whatever you think you've found, I suggest you reconsider before making baseless accusations. Adrian's jaw tightened. He had expected resistance, but not such an immediate shutdown. With respect, Ms. Grant, the discrepancies aren't baseless. The funds being deposited into the residents' accounts are significantly lower than... Do I need to remind you, she cut in sharply, that the residents sign legally binding consent forms? Every transaction is overseen by a medical professional as required by law. But the care costs, Adrian pressed, refusing to back down. They're inflated. Basic medical supplies are billed at... That's enough, she said, her voice hardening with finality. What you're describing is standard practice. The residents' care is expensive because their conditions are complex. Facilities like the Harding Center operate within a specific legal framework. Every penny is accounted for. Adrian's pulse quickened, but he forced himself to remain calm. And the accounts receiving large unmarked transfers, where do those funds go? A heavy silence followed. When Miss Grant finally spoke, her tone was icy, each word deliberate. Those transactions are none of your concern. Your role is to facilitate the lifespan exchanges, not to play auditor. You've been assigned to this account because we trust you can handle it without unnecessary complications. Don't make me question that trust. Adrian's grip tightened on the tablet. You're asking me to look the other way. I'm asking you to do your job, she replied coolly. You're a broker, not an investigator. The system is what it is. Focus on your responsibilities. The Harding Center generates significant revenue for the company, and we're not in the business of biting the hand that feeds us. Do you understand? Adrian hesitated, his thoughts racing. He understood all too well what she was implying. The system wasn't just flawed, it was protected by those who benefited from it, a web of legality and complacency designed to be untouchable. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow. Yes, Miss Grant, I understand. Good. Her tone lightened slightly but retained its edge. I knew I could count on you. Don't overthink this, Clarke. You have a bright future ahead if you stay focused. Let me know if there's anything else. The line disconnected before he could respond. Adrian set the tablet down, his hand trembling slightly. She hadn't denied the discrepancies. She hadn't even tried to justify them. Instead, she'd drawn a clear line, warning him to stay on the side that kept the machine running smoothly. Back in his apartment, Adrian slumped in his worn office chair, the glow of his computer monitor casting faint light across the darkened room. He hadn't planned to go this deep into the Harding Center's files tonight. A quick review of the day's transactions, some light note organization, that had been the plan. But the inconsistencies were like a splinter in his mind, impossible to ignore. Hours later, surrounded by empty coffee mugs and a clutter of papers, Adrian leaned forward, staring at the horrifying truths he had uncovered. Adrian had been cross-referencing residents' medical histories and transaction records, trying to better understand the Harding Center's operation beyond the financial irregularities. The gaps in the files had emerged quickly. Birth certificates, medical records, even basic biographical details were sparse, often trailing off into vague references to rural towns or distant cities. For some residents, it was as if their lives had only begun when they entered the Harding Center. The lack of prior data gnawed at him, a question taking root in his mind. Who were they before? As he delved deeper, the anomalies multiplied. Adrian widened his search, pulling data from public archives and external databases. Missing persons reports caught his eye, and as he scrolled through years of faces and names, the puzzle began to take shape. It started with Lily, the woman who giggled while stacking blocks in the lounge. Adrian froze at a 20-year-old photo of a toddler with the same wide-set eyes and dark waves of hair. But this wasn't a woman in her 60s. The photograph was a missing persons report for a 2-year-old girl who had vanished from a rural village hundreds of miles away. Adrian's pulse quickened as he searched for more. Each name led to another face, another missing child. A boy from a fishing town, last seen toddling near the docks. A baby girl taken from her crib in an industrial suburb. All of them gone without a trace, and all hauntingly similar to the residents he'd been working with for weeks. The truth struck him like a physical blow. Adrian shoved back from his desk, his chair scraping the floor as the horrific realization solidified. The Harding Center wasn't a rehabilitation facility. It was something far more sinister. The residents weren't victims of bad luck or poor decisions. They were children, trafficked, artificially aged through illegal lifespan transactions, their futures stolen and sold. The Hardings had turned them into commodities, exploiting their stolen years for profit. Adrian's hands trembled as he clicked through more files, desperate to disprove his conclusions. But the evidence was irrefutable. The Hardings hadn't just profited from these children, they had erased them, shredding their undeveloped minds to fragments. The residents' peculiar, childlike behaviors now made terrible sense. Their young minds, stunted by trauma and unnatural aging, couldn't raise alarms, couldn't comprehend their situation. Trapped in bodies forced to grow too fast, they lived in perpetual confusion. For a moment, Adrian sat motionless, the monitor's flicker casting shadows over his face. Then anger began to burn through his shock. He had known the system was broken, had told himself it was beyond saving. But this was something darker than he'd ever imagined. The Hardings hadn't just exploited the system. They had twisted it into something monstrous, preying on the most vulnerable in ways Adrian hadn't thought possible. Leaning forward, his jaw clenched, one thought cut through the haze, clear and unrelenting. Now that I know, what the hell am I going to do about it? Adrian had been waiting in the park for nearly half an hour, the damp chill of the early morning sinking into his jacket. He checked his watch, muttering a curse under his breath. Marcus finally emerged from the far side of the park, walking briskly, hands stuffed into his coat pockets. His prior polished look was gone, no tailored blazer, no air of effortless wealth, but traces remained, the sharp cut of his boots, the glint of a watch peeking out from his sleeve. His gaze flitted across the park, cautious, as if shadows might suddenly spring to life. "You're late," Adrian said, his tone flat, hands shoved into his own pockets for warmth. Marcus shrugged, his face tight. "Better late than dead," he replied in a low voice. A quick glance over his shoulder, then a nod toward a nearby bench. "Let's make this quick." Without a word, Adrian followed him to the weathered bench, both men sitting at opposite ends. For a moment, silence stretched between them, heavy and fraught. Marcus fidgeted, his knee bouncing, fingers tapping the bench's edge, until Adrian broke the tension. "I know about the kids," he said, his voice sharp but controlled. "I know where they come from, what's done to them, and I know you were part of it." Marcus stilled, his fingers pausing mid-tap. He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "So that's what this is about. I figured you'd dig deeper eventually. Should have warned the Hardings about you." "Why didn't you?" Adrian asked, leaning forward, elbows on his knees. "Why not warn them and stay in their good graces?" Marcus smirked, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Because I don't owe them anything. I played my part, got what I needed, and now I'm out. That's the deal, Adrian. Do your time, take your cut, and leave before it buries you." Adrian narrowed his eyes. "That easy, huh? Walk away with blood on your hands, conscience be damned?" "It's never easy," Marcus snapped, his smirk vanishing. "Don't kid yourself. But what choice do you think you have? Expose them? Turn them in? You think anyone up there cares?" He jabbed a finger skyward toward the distant gleaming towers. "The people in charge don't just look the other way. They depend on this. The system's too big, too deep. You can't fight it." Adrian's jaw tightened. "So I should just, what, join them?" Marcus leaned back with a weary sigh. "You already have, Adrian. You're just pretending you haven't. The day you walked into that center, you became part of it. The Hardings will give you the same deal they gave me. Stick to the rules, and in 15 years, you'll have more money than you'll know what to do with. Enough to buy your years back. Enough to buy anything." "And the kids?" Adrian asked quietly, anger seeping into his voice. "What about them?" "They're already gone," Marcus said bluntly. "They were gone the moment they were taken. Nothing you do changes that. The only question is whether you make something of this, or let it destroy you." He stood abruptly, brushing off his coat. "I'm leaving tomorrow. New name, new life, 30 years of time waiting for me at a clinic. You'd be smart to plan your exit before the Hardings decide you're a problem." Adrian stayed seated, watching Marcus walk away without looking back. The silence returned to the park, heavier now, as if the air itself carried the weight of Marcus's words. The next day passed in a haze of transaction logs and tightly controlled expressions, his mind set on the invitation the Hardings had extended earlier in the week. Dinner in Dr. Harding's private quarters, ostensibly to discuss his performance. He had hesitated to respond, but now the timing felt right. This would be his chance to confront them, and perhaps decide what came next. When Adrian reached the heavy oak door of the doctor's private room, the center was quiet, the corridors bathed in a warm, muted glow from sconces lining the walls. Most of the staff had long retired. He adjusted his tie, drew a steadying breath, and knocked. "Come in," called Dr. Harding's calm, familiar baritone. Stepping inside, Adrian was struck by the room's intimate grandeur. The scent of aged wood and leather mingled with the faint aroma of roasted vegetables and fresh bread. A modest dinner was arranged on a corner table beneath the soft light of a desk lamp. Evelyn stood by the sideboard pouring wine, her smile warm and practiced, the picture of an inviting hostess. Dr. Harding sat behind his desk, his sharp blue eyes lifting with measured approval as Adrian entered. "Ah, Adrian, right on time. Please, have a seat," Harding said, gesturing to one of the leather armchairs in front of the desk. "Evelyn, will you join us?" Evelyn nodded, carrying 2 glasses to the desk before seating herself beside her husband. Adrian sat opposite them, acutely aware of their scrutiny. The air between them felt charged, heavy with unspoken tension. "You have by now had time to get a sense of how we operate," Harding began, folding his hands on the desk. His tone was cordial, but an edge of authority lingered beneath it. "And I trust you've noticed how different we are from your other assignments." Adrian hesitated, his rehearsed words tangling in his mind under the weight of their gaze. He exhaled slowly, deciding to cut to the truth. "I've noticed more than that," he said carefully. "I've seen the discrepancies in the financials, the lack of records. I know about the residents, who they really are, where they came from. And yet," Harding said after a pause, "you're here. Why?" Adrian straightened in his seat, meeting Harding's unflinching stare. "Because I want to hear your side of it," he said, the words leaving him before he could reconsider. "You've built something here, something I can't ignore, but I need to understand why." The Hardings exchanged a glance, a silent conversation passing between them. Evelyn responded first, her tone soothing, almost maternal. "We knew you would uncover the truth eventually, Adrian. You're perceptive, one of the reasons we were so eager to bring you on board. We left the breadcrumbs for you to follow. Such revelations, we have found, are more easily digested when discovered by our partners for themselves." She leaned forward slightly, her faint smile unwavering. "What you've found, it's unpleasant, I'll admit, but have you considered the bigger picture? The necessity of what we do?" Harding followed, his voice calm and measured, like a professor guiding a skeptical student through a difficult lesson. "The world is broken, Adrian. You've seen it. The poverty, the desperation. These children were abandoned long before they came to us. We didn't create their suffering. We've simply found a way to make use of it, to create something valuable from what society has discarded." Adrian's fists clenched beneath the desk, but he kept his voice steady. "Valuable? You're stealing their lives." Evelyn's expression softened, her voice almost pleading. "And in return, we give them care, safety, a purpose. Without us, they would have nothing. You know that's true. The alternative is far worse." Harding leaned forward, his tone sharpening. "You've worked within the system. You've seen its cruelty. Tell me, how else do you think years are made affordable? Without us, without the steady supply we and others like us provide, longevity would remain in the hands of the elite. Yes, it's expensive, but this way, it's attainable." Adrian's mind raced, caught between the moral revulsion churning in his gut and the cold logic of their argument. He knew they weren't wrong about the system, its indifference, its brutality, and yet their solution was monstrous. Harding's voice softened again as he leaned back. "We're offering you an opportunity. Work with us, learn from us. In 15 years, you could walk away with more wealth and more life than you ever imagined. A new name, a new future. Isn't that what we're all working toward?" Adrian hesitated, the weight of their words pressing down like a physical force. Evelyn smiled, her expression almost pitying. "You don't have to decide tonight," she said gently. "But think carefully, Adrian. You've seen the world out there. You know what happens to those who fight the tide." The room fell into silence, the faint clink of Evelyn refilling his glass the only sound. Adrian left the Hardings late in the evening, his thoughts churning like a storm. The cool night air outside the center barely eased the loathing crawling beneath his skin. By the time he reached his apartment, the night had deepened to black, dawn still hours away. Kicking off his shoes, he collapsed into his chair, the Hardings' words looping in his mind, each one a brick in the wall of their justification. Hours later, he sat in the same chair, unmoving. Leaning back, Adrian closed his eyes and let the Hardings' voices echo in his memory. Their calm, rational framing should have disgusted him, but what unsettled him more was how much it made sense. The world was broken. He'd seen it in the hollow faces of his clients, the crumbling streets of the city's poorer districts, the resignation in people's eyes as they signed away their futures. The system crushed people, leaving the unadaptable to be ground into dust. But children? His jaw tightened, his stomach twisting. Adrian groaned, rubbing a hand down his face as he slumped forward, elbows on his knees. His thoughts dragged him back to the many times he'd struggled to make ends meet, the long hours, the guilt he'd buried just to pay his bills. He remembered how close he'd come to selling his own years, staring at the red past due notices piling up and the meager balance in his bank account. He knew what it meant to feel powerless. He also knew the grit it took to claw his way out of that hole, a hole he was always just one paycheck away from falling back into. What if the Hardings were right? What if this was the only way? They had offered him a vision he could barely fathom: wealth, freedom, a new life. Something more than just survival. In 15 years, he could walk away from this, bank account full, lifespan extended beyond the grasp of desperation. He could leave the gray, suffocating grind behind, but the faces of the children lingered, haunting fragments flashing behind his closed eyes. He opened them quickly, shoving back the guilt gnawing at him. They were already abandoned, he reminded himself, repeating the Hardings' reasoning. At least this way, their suffering isn't meaningless. At least this way, they're cared for. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling as the first pale rays of morning light slipped through the blinds. He told himself he wasn't a bad person. He was just surviving, like everyone else. Adrian stood outside the concealed door to the Harding Center's lower medical wing, the faint hum of machinery from above barely audible through the heavy walls. The hours since his dinner with the Hardings had passed in a haze of restless thought, but by morning, his decision was clear. Rationalizing it had been easier than expected. They weren't creating suffering, they were repurposing it. This system, monstrous as it seemed, was the inevitable evolution of a society that had long ago abandoned its weakest. Standing here now, Adrian assured himself he wasn't complicit. He was pragmatic. Illusions no longer held sway. The entrance clicked open with a quiet hiss, and Evelyn Harding ushered him inside. The basement-level facility was stark, its clinical coolness a sharp contrast to the Harding Center's curated warmth upstairs. Everything here was stripped to essentials. Clean white walls, a row of plain counters with sparse equipment, and a single reclining chair at the room's center. Dr. Harding waited nearby, his calm presence steady as ever. On the chair sat a girl, Emma. Small and fragile-looking, she wore an oversized hoodie, clutching a worn stuffed rabbit missing an ear. Her wide, confused eyes flickered between Adrian and Harding, sensing without understanding that nothing good was about to happen. Adrian avoided her gaze, focusing instead on the sleek transfer device in his hand. He had used it countless times before, but never like this. Only a licensed broker like him could perform a lifespan transfer. The device was programmed to sync exclusively with his biometric profile, locking out unauthorized users. Brokers were also trained to make real-time adjustments, calibrating for factors like age, metabolism, and neural stability. Transfers involving children were notoriously delicate, prone to complications like organ strain or systemic shock. Strict laws prohibited using the procedure on anyone under 18. The risks were just too great. For someone like Emma, still growing, even a minor miscalculation could cause irreversible damage. This wasn't something the Hardings or their staff could manage. Only Adrian could do this. His culpability was undeniable. Drawing a deep breath, he forced his thoughts into the professional rhythm he had honed over years of routine transactions. The procedure itself was simple. The implications were not. This wasn't about transferring years to a buyer or even about Emma's well-being. It was about utility. The years taken from her would be discarded, not sold, not used, erased into nothingness. Too many safeguards existed in the life markets to ever be able to launder these illegal years. The goal was purely to accelerate her body's growth. 5 years stolen, not for profit, but for expedience. Straightforward, Harding said, his tone as composed as his movements at the counter, where he reviewed files Adrian doubted were necessary. The ease with which he handled the situation made the process feel grotesquely routine. Bring her forward 5 years. That will put her at about 8. Adrian stepped closer to Emma, crouching slightly. She shrank back, clutching the rabbit tighter, her body motionless but her tearless, terrified eyes betraying her. "This won't hurt," Adrian murmured, though he doubted she understood or believed him. His voice felt distant, as though it belonged to someone else. She didn't respond, her gaze flickering between him and Harding, searching for reprieve where none existed. Adrian straightened, adjusted the device, and pressed it against her wrist. Her skin was cold, her pulse faint but steady beneath his fingertips. The machine hummed to life, its low vibration filling the sterile air. Emma tensed immediately. For adults, the effects were gradual. For her, the changes were stark and immediate. Her limbs lengthened, her frame stretched unnaturally under the oversized hoodie. Her baby fat melted away, her cheeks hollowing and jawline sharpening as her features transformed. Her hair grew slightly longer, but its luster dulled, strands turning brittle. Her once small hands became more proportionate, but still pale and trembling. When the hum stopped, Emma slumped in the chair, her shallow breaths uneven. She looked older, closer to 8, just as Harding had instructed, but her transformation felt wrong, unnatural. Her eyes, however, remained the same. Wide, confused, pleading silently for an explanation Adrian couldn't provide. "She'll adjust," Harding said, stepping forward to check her vitals. His voice was clinical, unfazed. "They always do. The mind catches up eventually." Adrian said nothing as he detached the device, its screen displaying the discarded years in cold, indifferent numbers. 5 years erased, not sold, not traded, simply gone. Nurses arrived to wheel Emma away, their efficiency honed by repetition. The rabbit was still gripped in her hands. Adrian stared at it for a moment before looking away. This wasn't new, he told himself. Just another transaction. Nothing had changed. The year following Adrian's first illegal procedure passed quickly, and he adjusted seamlessly to his role, falsifying records, overseeing transactions, and conducting more accelerated aging procedures. The secrecy surrounding his tasks grew airtight. Every transfer, every fabricated file, a carefully maintained link in the chain of exploitation. The discomfort that had once gnawed at him lingered, but it was muffled now, buried beneath a steady stream of rationalizations. The lower medical wing of the Harding Center became his second office. Stark and windowless, it was a world apart from the center's elegant facade above. Beneath the polished gardens and pristine halls, Adrian stood before Emma again. She slouched in the recliner, still clutching the stuffed rabbit, as if it might protect her from the horrors she knew, on some level, awaited her. She looked older, 13 by appearance, but her hollow, uncertain gaze revealed the childlike mind still trapped within. The hoodie she wore hung loose on her longer frame, her limbs lanky and awkward in their new proportions. Blinking up at Adrian, she seemed disoriented, as if struggling to place him in the fragmented haze of her memory. Adrian glanced at the sleek transfer device in his hand, his expression impassive. He'd performed the procedure often enough on other children, by this point, to banish most hesitation. The first time had been a storm of guilt and disbelief. By the second, the storm had dulled to a drizzle. Now, preparing for Emma's third, it was little more than a faint echo. Harding's words rang louder. "They'll adjust. The mind catches up eventually." Adrian wasn't sure he believed that anymore, but belief wasn't required, just action. "She's ready," Harding said, his voice calm and detached. He stood by the monitor displaying Emma's vitals, not sparing Adrian a glance. The procedure had become too routine for supervision. "Take her forward another 5 years, 18 this time." The sooner she transitions into adulthood, the more stable she'll be. Adrian crouched beside Emma, attaching the calibration nodes to her wrist. She twitched but didn't resist, her compliance unsettlingly automatic. He activated the machine and the low hum filled the room. The changes came quickly, as always. Her limbs lengthened, her facial features sharpened, her skin stretched taut over an angular frame. When the procedure ended, Emma looked like a young woman, 18 in body, but painfully still a child inside. She blinked slowly, her vacant eyes briefly meeting Adrian's. For an instant, he thought he saw something there, recognition, maybe a question, but it vanished before he could grasp it. "She'll be fine," Harding said, stepping forward to check her vitals. "Start the paperwork for her integration as a full resident. We'll prepare her for the next phase of care." Adrian nodded wordlessly, detaching the device and packing it away. As nurses wheeled Emma out of the room, he focused on his tablet, scrolling through fabricated consent forms and falsified medical histories. The task was second nature now, another step in a process too vast to undo. The next time he performed the procedure on Emma, it would be upstairs, in the legal and profitable wing. As the hum of the machine faded into silence, Adrian completed the documentation and left the medical wing. His steps were steady, his mind already shifting to the next procedure. The evening sky darkened to a bruised shade of purple as Adrian stepped out of his car, the crunch of gravel beneath his polished shoes breaking the stillness. Ahead, the sprawling estate loomed, its illuminated facade radiating unrestrained wealth. It was the kind of opulence that still unsettled him, even now, after years of striving to escape the poverty he had known. He adjusted his tailored suit, the fabric stiff and unfamiliar. Tonight's gala was more than just an event. It was his initiation into the elite. He needed to look like he belonged. The Hardings had insisted he attend, presenting it as a reward for his exceptional service and a chance to meet the people whose lives he helped sustain. Adrian wasn't naive. He understood this was as much about solidifying his allegiance as it was about celebrating his achievements. But it was also a moment he had worked toward for years, a glimpse of the life he had sacrificed so much to attain. The estate grounds mirrored the Harding Center's pristine facade, but on an even grander scale. Marble fountains spilled water in graceful arcs, their sound blending with the murmur of elegantly dressed guests. Adrian ascended the stone steps, the golden glow from towering windows beckoning him inside. A doorman, silent and impassive, opened the heavy oak doors, ushering him into a world he had only dreamed of entering. Inside, luxury reigned. Crystal chandeliers cast glittering light across polished marble floors, and champagne flowed freely as laughter rippled through the air. Guests spoke in easy tones of top-ups and Mediterranean retreats, their words carrying the untroubled detachment of those who had never known desperation. Evelyn Harding appeared almost immediately, her midnight blue gown shimmering as she wove through the crowd with practiced ease. "Adrian Clarke," she announced, introducing him to one cluster of guests after another, her voice warm yet commanding. "One of our most trusted partners at the center." The words felt rehearsed, but they carried weight. Each handshake and nod was an acknowledgement of his role in the delicate machinery that sustained these people's unnaturally long lives. Adrian played along, his responses polite and measured, conscious of Evelyn's watchful gaze, ensuring he stayed within the bounds of propriety. As the evening wore on, Adrian found himself lingering at the edge of the ballroom, an untouched glass of champagne in hand. In the mirrored surface of a panel, he caught his own reflection, polished, composed, and carefully curated to fit this world. Yet beneath the facade, unease simmered. The wealth surrounding him was intoxicating, but it came with a suffocating emptiness. This was the life he had worked for, the escape he had dreamed of, and still it didn't feel like enough. He tipped the glass to his lips, the bitter taste reminding him of the compromises that had brought him here. He told himself he belonged, or that, soon, he would. The years passed in a strange rhythm, blending into a seamless routine of transactions, meticulously managed accounts, and the quiet, persistent guilt Adrian had long since learned to suppress. Predictability had become his anchor. The procedures, the falsified records, the polite lies delivered to residents and outsiders alike. The Harding Center thrived, its polished exterior concealing the darker forces driving its success. Adrian's role within the operation grew until what once felt uneasy became second nature. Now, with his tenure nearing its end, he prepared for the moment he would step away and vanish into the life he had carefully built in the shadows. Adrian's office, once stark and utilitarian, now carried an air of understated luxury. A sleek walnut desk dominated the space, its polished surface gleaming under the warm light of a custom lamp. The shelves lining the walls held more than just files. Rare books and curated decor spoke to the quiet indulgence he allowed himself here, away from prying eyes. The email from Evelyn Harding had arrived that morning. Let's finalize the next steps. Concise, unmistakable. Adrian knew what it meant. The Hardings were preparing for yet another transformation, perfectly timed to align with his impending departure. Over the years, Adrian had pieced together their history, 3 carefully staged deaths, long before his involvement. Each time, the Hardings re-emerged as their own children or grandchildren, seamlessly resuming control of the family business. The orchestrations allowed them to evade suspicion and preserve the wealth the care home alone could never explain. The profits of a legitimate care home could never account for the years they purchased for themselves, so those purchases had to be hidden behind this subterfuge. It was a masterstroke of reinvention, and Adrian couldn't help but admire their brilliance. Unlike brokers like himself or his predecessor, Marcus, who disappeared into obscurity, the Hardings cultivated permanence. They didn't flee, they evolved, remaining in plain sight while avoiding scrutiny. Over wine one evening, Evelyn had even joked that she still missed the name Margaret, a persona she'd adopted 2 transformations ago. Leaning back in his chair, Adrian reviewed his latest financial reports. The fortune he had amassed over the years sat largely untouched in offshore accounts, awaiting his eventual escape. The Hardings had drilled caution into him early on. "You can't buy a new life," Dr. Harding had warned, "if your spending draws attention to the one you're leaving behind." Adrian had taken the advice to heart. His modest lifestyle at the center was part of the carefully cultivated image, a diligent professional with little to show for years of service beyond a steady paycheck. The sound of Evelyn's voice cut through his thoughts, sharp yet tinged with her trademark charm. "Everything in order?" she asked, stepping into his office with a glass of wine in hand. As always, she didn't wait for an invitation. Dr. Harding followed a moment later, a folder under his arm. He set it on Adrian's desk, its weight more symbolic than literal. "We've finalized the timeline," Dr. Harding said evenly. "Another year, and we transition. By then, you'll be well into your new life." Adrian nodded, his expression neutral. "And the details for the next identities?" "Already in motion," Evelyn replied, taking a sip of wine. "We'll step into the roles of our grandchildren this time. It's been long enough since we were the children of the last cycle. Seamless as always." Dr. Harding leaned against the desk, his gaze steady. "You've done well here, Adrian. Better than Marcus, certainly. Everything runs smoothly, and you've kept your head down. In a few months, when it's time for you to leave, there'll be no loose ends." Adrian allowed himself a faint smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I've followed the plan. And it will pay off," Evelyn said softly, her tone almost soothing. "You've earned it. 30 years of life, ready to be purchased and transferred the moment you need them. A new name, a new city. What we've built for ourselves, we've ensured for you. A fresh start without the weight of the past." Adrian's gaze fell to the folder on his desk, its contents a meticulous roadmap to his next chapter. The Hardings would stay behind, assuming their new roles, while he disappeared. For a fleeting moment, unease flickered within him, a ghost of the guilt he had worked so hard to bury. But as always, he pushed it aside. This was survival, and survival demanded sacrifices. The next evening, Adrian wandered through the Harding Center's garden. Dusk had settled, bathing the manicured hedges in muted hues of orange and violet. He hadn't planned to linger. Even now, so close to his retirement, his workload was endless. Reports to review, procedures to prepare. But the stillness called to him, offering a rare reprieve from the mechanical grind of his days. He told himself he needed fresh air, though deep down he knew it was more than that. The crunch of gravel underfoot marked his slow pace as his thoughts drifted. Residents sat scattered along wrought iron benches, their gazes vacant, their hunched figures at odds with the pristine beauty around them. Adrian had long stopped noticing them, their frailty fading into the backdrop of his routine. But tonight, something held his attention, an unfamiliar unease tugging at his practiced detachment. Then he saw her, Emma. She sat alone beneath the sprawling oak, her frail frame bent forward as if the weight of existence might topple her. Thin, trembling hands rested on her lap, her veined skin stretched over brittle bones. Her face, deeply lined and framed by limp, gray-streaked hair, was that of someone nearing the end of life. And yet, Adrian knew the truth. Emma was barely 18, her body a grotesque canvas shaped by years stolen through one transfer after another. He froze, torn between the urge to turn away and an inexplicable need to approach. Before he could decide, his feet moved of their own accord. Emma's watery, unfocused eyes rose at the sound of his steps, a flicker of recognition, or something like it, glinting through the fog. She blinked slowly, her expression strained but not entirely blank. "Adrian," she rasped, her voice faint and cracked from disuse. The sound of his name hit him like a blade. She hadn't said it in years, perhaps not ever, not like this. Stopping a few feet away, he hesitated. "Emma," he said softly, the name feeling foreign on his tongue. "You should be inside. It's getting cold." She didn't respond to his words. Instead, her frail hand rose slightly, trembling midair. "Why?" she asked, her voice quivering with an emotion he couldn't name. "Why am I like this?" Adrian's throat tightened. Her lucidity was more unbearable than the emptiness he was used to. She wasn't resigned or absent, she was lost, clawing at the edges of a memory, desperate to piece herself together. He tried to reply, but his mouth just hung open, his voice faltering under the weight of her question. What could he say? That she was a casualty of greed, a victim of a system that valued years over lives? That her suffering was, in part, his doing? He swallowed hard, the silence between them heavy. "I don't know," he said at last, the lie bitter in his mouth. Emma held his gaze a moment longer before her hand fell back to her lap, her shoulders sagging as if she'd expected no better answer. Her eyes drifted to the gravel path, her brief clarity dissolving into the haze. Adrian opened his mouth to speak, anything to break the silence, but a voice behind him interrupted. "Emma, sweetheart, it's time to come inside," Evelyn Harding said brightly, her tone cheerful, but her eyes sharp as they swept over the scene. Adrian straightened reflexively, stepping back as Evelyn approached. She rested a hand on Emma's shoulder with practiced ease, her polished smile unwavering. Emma flinched at the touch but didn't resist, allowing herself to be guided back toward the building without a word. The next few weeks passed uneventfully, though the image of Emma's trembling hand and her broken question, "Why am I like this?" lingered in Adrian's mind. He tried to push it aside, reminding himself it was irrelevant now. His plans were nearly complete. The years spent at the Harding Center had served their purpose, to secure his future, and now that future was within reach. He had entered this role willingly, seeing it as his escape from a life of struggle. And he would leave it on his own terms, unlike Marcus, who had slunk away under a veil of excuses. Adrian's departure was planned, precise, and even celebrated by the Hardings as proof of what loyalty and efficiency could achieve. When Evelyn summoned him to the grand entrance hall on an overcast afternoon, Adrian expected another routine step in handing over his responsibilities. Evelyn stood at the base of the grand staircase, poised and calm. Beside her was a young man whose bright, eager expression made Adrian feel weary by contrast. "Adrian, this is Michael," Evelyn said smoothly, gesturing to the young man. "He's been selected by Lifespan Transactions to shadow you, and when you're ready to step away, he'll carry the torch forward." Michael stepped forward, extending a hand. "Mr. Clarke," he said, his wide, slightly nervous smile stretching across his face. "It's an honor to meet you. I've heard so much about your incredible work here. I can't wait to learn from you." Adrian hesitated briefly before shaking the offered hand. Michael's grip was firm but tentative, his youth and inexperience apparent in every movement. He looked to be in his late 20s, his suit slightly oversized for his lean frame, and his wide brown eyes sparkled with nervous excitement. Adrian recognized the look. He had worn it himself when he first arrived, if somewhat less enthusiastically, and his introduction had been far less polished. "Welcome aboard," Adrian said evenly, releasing Michael's hand. His tone was polite but cool. Evelyn smiled faintly, her gaze shifting between them. Michael comes to us with Ms. Grant's highest recommendation. She assigned him this role herself, personally selected him for the position, in fact. There was a subtle note of pride in her voice, as if presenting a carefully chosen gift. She felt a more gradual transition was appropriate this time. Adrian nodded, understanding the implication. Ms. Grant, still at the helm of Lifespan Transactions, had perfected her methods over the years. Using her seniority and the vast wealth it afforded her, she purchased extra years meticulously, extending her life legally and maintaining her iron grip on the department. She had learned from past mistakes. Adrian himself had been a hasty replacement for Marcus, who had cracked under the pressure of the Hardings operation. This time, there would be no such abrupt handoff. Michael had been groomed, coached, and now presented as a seamless successor. Even so, Adrian felt a flicker of resentment. Michael was being ushered in with care and opportunity, while Adrian had been thrown into the deep end, left to navigate the Hardings' demanding methods on his own. He brushed the thought aside. What did it matter? Michael's future would eventually mirror Adrian's, shaped by the same compromises and rationalizations. "Follow me," Adrian said curtly, turning toward the medical wing. Michael followed closely, his enthusiasm undimmed as he peppered Adrian with questions about the center's operations. Adrian answered mechanically, his thoughts elsewhere, on the task ahead, on the long road that had brought him here, and on the inevitability of Emma's final transaction. They arrived at the medical wing in silence. Adrian requested Emma's file, and the nurses soon wheeled her in. Her frail body slumped in the recliner, so withered that even the smallest movements seemed like acts of defiance against time. He glanced at Michael, who watched intently, his expression a mix of awe and curiosity. "Okay, Michael, pay attention," Adrian said, his voice steadier than he expected. "This will be your job soon." Kneeling beside Emma, he attached the device to her wrist. A memory surfaced. Emma, as a wide-eyed 3-year-old, clutching a stuffed rabbit, staring at him in quiet, confused terror. He recalled the soft hum of the machine as it drained away her first 5 years, her body stretching and changing, her mind reeling in the aftermath. Now, at the edge of death, her time was almost gone, and Adrian's years at the center mirrored her own, beginning together and ending together. But while Adrian was set to leave with 30 new years, Emma's body was a husk, unable to sustain itself much longer. The machine hummed softly as the transfer began. Emma seemed to shrink even further, her shallow breaths the only sign of life. When it was over, her chest rose and fell faintly, the last flickers of a life nearing its end. She would likely die within months, her artificially aged body failing her. "She's handled this remarkably well," Michael said, his voice light with the naivety of someone who hadn't yet grasped the weight of what he'd witnessed. Adrian didn't respond. He turned away, his mind retreating. Emma had been both a beginning and an ending, a silent testament to the cost of the life he had chosen. He was young, wealthy, and free. She was nearly gone. And yet, for a fleeting moment, he wondered who had truly paid the higher price. Adrian stared at the unopened champagne bottle on the marble counter of his penthouse, its gold foil glinting under the soft overhead lights. Beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city skyline stretched endlessly, glittering with the cold, distant beauty of wealth and power. It had been 3 weeks since he moved here, slipping seamlessly into a new identity with the precision the Hardings had promised. His name, his records, even his face. Every detail had been meticulously rewritten, erasing the Adrian Clarke who had worked as a broker at the Harding Center. The transition had been flawless. The accounts he'd nurtured over years were unfrozen, and the wealth he'd painstakingly accumulated was now his to enjoy. 30 new years of life had been transferred to him the day after he left the Harding Center, their effects immediate and astonishing. His skin regained its elasticity, his features sharpened, and a vitality he hadn't felt in a decade coursed through his body. But when he caught his reflection, the man staring back was unrecognizable. A version of himself in his prime, unburdened by exhaustion or compromise. Beneath the polished exterior, however, a hollowness gnawed at him, growing louder with each passing day. He stepped out onto the balcony, the cool night air brushing against his skin as he leaned on the railing. His new life was as he had planned, quiet, insulated, and steeped in luxury. The penthouse, located in a country far from where he had built his career, offered both anonymity and opulence. With investments already in motion, his wealth was more than enough to sustain his perpetual youth indefinitely. He had made it. Finally, he was one of the elite. But inside, the tablet he'd been avoiding all evening glowed softly on the counter, listing the details of the years he had purchased. 600 years distilled into 30. That was the exchange rate, the way the technology worked. With a sigh, he opened the audit log. It was just professional curiosity, he told himself. Scrolling through, he watched transaction codes flash past, the years drawn from every corner of the world, pooled from hundreds of anonymous sellers. Most entries blurred together in an unremarkable stream of numbers and letters, until one stopped him cold. A single code stood out, instantly recognizable. He froze, his finger hovering over the screen. Emma's code. Her last 5 years, the remnants of a life he had watched wither under his hand, had been among those distilled into his own. The realization struck like a blow, leaving him breathless. Her last 5 years stolen to give him 3 months of youth. Adrian set the tablet down carefully, his hand lingering on the counter as though to steady himself. Emma's code etched itself into his thoughts, sharper than it had any right to be, slicing through the carefully crafted narrative he'd built to justify his decisions. He turned toward the skyline, its shimmering expanse suddenly dimmer, less infinite. He wasn't just surviving in a broken, cruel system. He was the system. And every breath he took was built on the lives he had stolen from children.